He saw her uniform and judged her worth, but he had no idea who she really was. The restaurant was designed to impress people who were already used to being impressed. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished glass tables, while soft instrumental music played in the background, carefully selected to enhance an atmosphere of quiet power. Every detail inside the space carried intention, from the spacing between tables to the tone of the staff's voices. Nothing existed without purpose, because this was not just a restaurant. It was a place where status was displayed. And tonight, the room was filled with it. Men in tailored suits spoke in controlled tones, their conversations layered with business, influence, and unspoken agreements. Women dressed in elegance that spoke of generational wealth moved through the space with quiet confidence. Laughter existed, but it was measured, never careless. Everything here reflected control. Everything here reflected power. And among all of it, moved someone who did not seem to belong. Ava Monroe. Her presence did not demand attention. It moved past it, dressed in a simple, perfectly pressed uniform. She carried herself with quiet precision. Her posture was straight, her movements efficient, her expression neutral yet composed. She blended into the background the way someone trained to go unnoticed often does. But blending in is not the same as being insignificant. That was the first thing people misunderstood about her. She moved between tables with calm consistency, placing orders, adjusting settings, responding to requests before they were fully spoken. Her awareness of the room was not accidental. It was sharp, observant, deliberate, every movement measured, every detail noted. Because Ava Monroe was not just working in that environment, she was reading it. That was the intellectual hook. Because the difference between someone who serves and someone who studies while serving is everything. Most of the guests didn't notice her, and the ones who didn't look twice, except one, Grayson Vale. He didn't enter the restaurant quietly. He never did, not because he was loud, but because presence like his carried weight. Conversations shifted slightly when he walked in, attention redirected. Even if subtly, people like Grayson did not need introductions. They were recognized. Tall, sharply dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit him with exact precision, Grayson moved with the kind of confidence that came from never needing approval. His expression remained composed, his gaze focused, his posture relaxed, but controlled. Everything about him signaled authority. Not requested, expected. He took his seat without hesitation, his attention already shifting toward the people he was meeting. Business associates, influential figures, conversations that mattered, at least, to him. Ava approached his table the same way she approached every other. Professional, unremarkable, controlled. But the moment she stepped into his space, he noticed her, not for who she was, for what she represented. Service. Her voice remained steady as she acknowledged the table. Her tone calm, respectful, and measured. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She moved through the routine with quiet efficiency. Grayson barely looked at her, because in his world, people like her existed in categories, and she had already been placed into one. Temporary, replaceable, unimportant. He gave his order without pause, his tone flat, his attention already shifting away before she fully processed his words. There was no hostility in his behavior, just dismissal, the kind that comes naturally to people who have never needed to see beyond the surface. Ava did not react, because reactions, in environments like this, are noticed, and being noticed was not her goal. She wrote the order down with calm precision, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. There was no offense in her eyes, no frustration, only control. But something about her did not align with the role she appeared to play. It was subtle, almost invisible. The way she stood, not stiff but composed. The way she listened, not passively but attentively. The way her gaze moved, not aimlessly, but with awareness. Small details, but details. Define truth. Grayson noticed one of them, not consciously, not immediately, but it registered. Because something about her presence lacked the hesitation he was used to seeing in staff. There was no nervous energy, no attempt to impress, no underlying urgency to please. She simply did her job, without trying to be anything more. And strangely, that made her stand out. His attention lingered for a second longer than it should have, then disappeared, because his world did not allow distractions. Ava moved away from the table, her steps smooth, her focus already shifting to the next task. But internally, she had noticed him too, not because of his status, because of his behavior, the way he spoke, the way he dismissed, the way he assumed. People like Grayson were not new to her. She had seen them before, different faces, same patterns. And patterns are easy to read once you understand them. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she delivered orders, her attention balanced between tasks and observation. She didn't linger. She didn't rush. She simply existed within the space, on her own terms. That was what no one understood, because to everyone else, she was just a waitress. But to someone paying attention, she was something else entirely. Grayson's conversation continued, his focus locked on business matters that carried weight beyond that room. Numbers, strategies, influence. His world operated on structure, precision, and control. And within that structure, there was no room for unpredictability, which is why Ava's presence stayed in the back of his mind longer than expected, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she hadn't. She hadn't reacted the way most did, and that created a question, one he didn't consciously ask, but one that lingered anyway. Time passed, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing without disruption. Plates were cleared, drinks refilled, conversations advanced. Everything remained perfect. Everything remained controlled, until a small moment shifted something. A guest at another table dropped a glass. The sound was sharp, breaking through the calm atmosphere for just a second. Heads turned briefly, attention flickering toward the disturbance before returning to normal. But Ava was already moving, not hurried, not startled, prepared. She reached the table with quiet efficiency, her movements precise as she handled the situation without drawing attention. No unnecessary gestures, no visible stress, just control. Grayson noticed again, because this time it was clearer. Her actions were not reactive. They were practiced, not the kind of practice learned in a few weeks, the kind built over time, refined, consistent, and beneath that, something else. Education, discipline, grace, things that did not align with the role she was playing. His gaze followed her briefly as she finished handling the situation and moved away again. This time, he didn't dismiss it immediately, because now there was a pattern, and patterns lead to truth. Ava returned to his table once more, placing the next course down with the same control precision as before. Her movements remained calm, her expression neutral. But as she adjusted the placement of a glass, her sleeve shifted slightly, just enough to reveal something small, a detail most would miss. But not him. A faint mark, not a scar, not damage, something older, something intentional, a symbol, barely visible, but real. Grayson's gaze sharpened slightly, because that did not belong, not here, not on someone like her. His attention lifted toward her face again, this time more focused, more deliberate. But Ava had already stepped back, her expression unchanged, her presence returning to the background where it belonged, or where it appeared to belong. Because now, he wasn't completely convinced. Something about her didn't fit, and once something doesn't fit, it becomes impossible to ignore. The room continued as normal. The conversations, the movement, the illusion, everything remained intact, but a shift had occurred. Small, invisible, but real, because now Grayson Vale had noticed her, not as a waitress, but as a question. And questions demand answers. Ava felt it too, not his gaze specifically, but the shift in attention, because she was used to it, used to being overlooked, and used to the rare moments when someone looked a little closer. Those moments were dangerous because they led to recognition, and recognition was something she could not afford. Her movements became slightly more precise, her awareness sharper, because now she had to be careful not to make mistakes. but to avoid being seen. The difference was critical. Grayson leaned back slightly in his chair, his attention no longer fully absorbed in the conversation around him. His thoughts had shifted, even if subtly, because something about her refused to stay simple. And simplicity is what he expected from people like her. But she wasn't simple. That much was clear now. The question was, why? Ava approached once more, this time to finalize the table service. Her posture remained composed, her expression unchanged. But this time, his attention didn't move away. It stayed, focused, intentional. And as she prepared to step back, he spoke, not loudly, not harshly, but enough to stop her movement. His tone carried the same quiet authority as before, but now there was something else in it. Curiosity. Ava paused, just for a moment, her gaze lifting slightly, meeting his, and in that brief second, something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, because for the first time, he wasn't looking at her like she was invisible. He was looking at her like she mattered, and that changed the moment. Her expression remained controlled, her posture steady, but her eyes held something deeper, something that did not belong to someone in her position, something that had been there all along, just hidden. Grayson saw it clearly, and in that instant, his assumption cracked, not completely, but enough, because now he understood one thing. He had been wrong, not about everything, but about her, and that realization created tension, because people like him do not like being wrong. Ava broke the eye contact first, her composure returning instantly as she stepped back, her role reestablished, her presence blending into the background once again. But the moment remained unfinished, because now there was something between them, not connection, not understanding, a question, and questions do not disappear. They grow. Grayson's gaze followed her one last time, his thoughts no longer aligned with the conversation at his table, because now his focus had shifted, and once focus shifts, everything else changes. Ava moved through the room once more, her awareness sharper than before, her control tighter, her presence quieter, because she knew something had changed, not externally, but internally, and internal shifts are the most dangerous, because they lead to action, and action leads to consequences. She approached another table, her posture steady, her movements precise. But as she adjusted the setting, her attention flickered, briefly, toward the entrance. A figure had arrived, one that did not belong to the usual pattern of the room. And in that moment, everything aligned, because this was not coincidence. This was the beginning of something else. Ava's composure did not break, but something inside her shifted, because now the past was no longer distant. It was here, and as she turned slightly, her gaze steady, her voice calm, she spoke a name that did not belong in that room, a name no waitress should have known. And in that single moment, everything changed. He thought she was beneath him until she said a name no waitress should have known. One name turned his arrogance into silence. The shift that began as a quiet disturbance did not fade. It sharpened. The moment Ava Monroe spoke that name, calmly, clearly, without hesitation, the atmosphere inside the restaurant changed in a way that could not be reversed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute, because names like that do not belong in the mouths of strangers. Grayson Vale heard it, not as sound, as impact. His posture stilled almost instantly, the conversation at his table dissolving into background noise without him realizing it. The rhythm of the room continued, but for him, everything had paused, because the name she had spoken was not ordinary. Eleanor Vale, his mother. The reaction did not appear immediately on his face, because men like Grayson were trained not to react, but internally, everything shifted. That was the emotional hook, because arrogance collapses the moment it meets something it cannot explain. His gaze moved toward Ava again, sharper now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual. This time it carried intent, recognition, suspicion, control, Ava, however, did not react to the shift she had caused. At least, not visibly. Her posture remained composed, her expression steady, her movements controlled. She did not look toward him again. She did not acknowledge the disruption. She simply continued, as if she had not just altered the entire structure of the moment, but inside, she had already registered it, because she knew exactly what that name would do, and more importantly, who it would reach. The entrance of the restaurant had shifted subtly moments before, not in noise, in attention, because someone important had arrived. Not loud, not announced, but recognized. Eleanor Vale did not enter rooms unnoticed. She didn't need to. Her presence carried a different kind of authority, quieter than Grayson's, but deeper. Whereas influence was sharp and immediate, hers was layered, built over years of controlled decisions and silent power. She moved through the restaurant with calm precision, her posture elegant, her expression composed. Her appearance reflected wealth, but not just financial wealth. History, position, control, and as she stepped further into the room, the shift deepened. Ava saw her, not as a guest, as something else entirely. Not surprise, recognition. That was what made the difference. Because recognition means history. Ava's movement slowed slightly, not enough for others to notice, but enough to confirm something internal, something important, something unresolved. She adjusted her position naturally, aligning herself within the flow of the room while maintaining distance. Her intention was clear: avoid attention, because attention, in this moment, was dangerous. Grayson stood from his seat, not abruptly, but deliberately, because now, this was no longer just a question. It was a situation. His gaze remained locked on Ava, even as his mother approached the table. He did not greet her immediately. He did not shift his focus, because the presence that mattered was not the one expected. Eleanor noticed that. Of course she did. She followed his line of sight. And then, she saw her. Ava Monroe. For a brief second, something broke. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone else to understand, but enough, because Eleanor Vale did not react like someone seeing a stranger. She reacted like someone recognizing a memory she had buried. Her steps slowed, almost imperceptibly, but real. That was the intellectual hook, because when powerful people lose control for even a second, it reveals more truth than words ever could. Ava felt it, that recognition, that moment. And for the first time since the name had been spoken, her control wavered, not in movement, not in posture, in awareness, because she had not expected this. Not like this, not here. Her eyes lifted slightly, meeting Eleanor's from across the room. And in that instant, everything aligned. Past, present, truth, silence. No words were exchanged. None were needed, because both of them understood something no one else in that room could. History had just walked into the present. Grayson saw it, clearly, the way his mother stopped, the way her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to break the pattern he had known his entire life. Eleanor Vale did not hesitate. She did not lose composure. She did not reveal uncertainty. But in that 1 second, she had. And that was impossible, which meant this situation was not normal, not controlled, not expected. His attention sharpened further, his mind moving quickly, analyzing every detail, every reaction, every inconsistency. Because now, this was no longer curiosity. This was investigation. Ava broke the eye contact first, deliberately, because holding it would confirm too much. Her movements resumed immediately, smooth, professional, controlled. She turned slightly, shifting her focus back to her responsibilities, her presence blending into the environment once more. But it was too late, because now she had been seen, not as a waitress, as something else, something connected. Grayson stepped toward his mother now, finally acknowledging her presence. His posture remained controlled, but his attention remained divided, because the question had already formed. And questions like this demand answers. Eleanor's composure returned almost instantly, her expression settling back into its usual calm, her posture straightening with quiet authority. but something remained. A trace, a memory, a reaction she could not fully erase. She greeted him with familiarity, her presence steady once more, her role reestablished. But her attention did not stay with him. It shifted, again, toward Ava, and that confirmed everything. Grayson saw it, and in that moment, his certainty broke completely, because now there was no doubt this was not coincidence. This was connection. The room continued to function, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter, movements more measured. Something had shifted beneath the surface, even if most did not understand what, because tension, when real, does not need explanation. It is felt. Ava moved carefully now, her awareness heightened, her actions more controlled than before. She avoided direct paths that would bring her closer to Eleanor. She adjusted her positioning within the room, not to escape, to manage, because being seen was now unavoidable, but being understood was not. Grayson watched her, closely, no longer casually. Every movement she made now carried meaning, every decision intentional, because now he was no longer looking at a role, he was looking at a person, and that person did not match the life she appeared to live. His thoughts aligned quickly, connecting fragments, building patterns. A waitress who carried herself with discipline, who spoke a name tied to power without hesitation, who triggered a reaction in someone like Eleanor Vale. There was only one conclusion. She did not belong here, at least not in the way she appeared. Eleanor stepped forward slightly, her presence drawing subtle attention from those nearby, but her focus remained narrow, precise, directed toward Ava, not openly, but undeniably. And Ava felt it, because attention like that cannot be ignored. Her breathing remained steady, her posture controlled. But internally, everything had shifted, because this moment was not supposed to happen. Not now, not here. Grayson moved slightly closer, positioning himself where he could observe both of them clearly. His role had changed completely. He was no longer participating. He was analyzing, and what he saw did not make sense, which made it dangerous, because things that do not make sense often hide something bigger. Ava finally turned slightly, aligning her movement toward Eleanor's direction. Not directly, not openly, but enough to acknowledge the unavoidable. And for a brief second, their proximity closed. Not fully, but enough. Enough for something silent to pass between them. Recognition, regret, something deeper. Eleanor's expression shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. And this time, Grayson saw it clearly, because now he was looking for it. And what he saw confirmed everything. This was not a stranger. This was someone his mother knew. Someone important enough to affect her. Someone significant enough to change her behavior. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, her posture remaining composed, her expression controlled. But the moment had already happened. The connection had already been revealed. And now there was no going back. Grayson's mind moved faster now, questions forming faster than answers could appear. Who was she? Why did she know his mother? Why had his mother reacted like that? And most importantly, why was she here? Not as a guest, not as someone of status, but as a waitress. That contradiction was the problem, because it didn't align. And when things don't align, they break systems. Ava stepped back again, creating distance, returning to her role, her presence fading once more into the background. But this time, it didn't work, because now she had been seen. Fully. Grayson did not look away, because now he couldn't, not until he understood, not until the pattern made sense, not until the truth was clear. Eleanor remained still for a moment longer, her composure restored, but her thoughts clearly unsettled, because the past had just returned, and it had done so in the last place she expected. The room slowly resumed its rhythm, but the tension remained embedded within it, because nothing about this moment was finished. It had only just begun. Grayson's final realization settled with sharp clarity, because now the question was no longer who she was, but how she knew his mother. The poorest-looking person in the room was carrying the richest secret. The question that had formed in Grayson Vale's mind did not fade. It expanded. What had begun as a moment of disruption, one unexpected name spoken in the wrong place, had now turned into something far more complex. The patterns no longer aligned. And for someone like Grayson, misalignment was not something to ignore. It was something to investigate. His gaze remained fixed on Ava Monroe, even as the restaurant slowly attempted to return to its natural rhythm. Conversations resumed, movements continued, and the illusion of normalcy began to rebuild itself. But for him, nothing was normal anymore, because now he was looking past the uniform. That was the intellectual hook. Because the moment perception shifts from surface to depth, reality changes completely. Ava moved through the room with the same quiet precision she had maintained from the beginning. Her posture was controlled, her steps measured, her expression calm. But now, every detail meant something. Grayson noticed the way she held the tray, not casually, but with balance that came from practice beyond service work. The way her gaze avoided unnecessary interaction, not out of fear, but out of discipline. The way her presence did not shrink under pressure, but adjusted. These were not traits learned in a restaurant. They were trained, refined, conditioned over time, which meant her life had not started here. And that realization changed everything. Across the room, Eleanor Vale remained composed, but her earlier reaction had not been forgotten. Grayson did not need to look at her again to know that she was aware, because she always was. The connection between them, his mother and this woman, had not been imagined. It had been real, and now it demanded explanation. Ava felt the shift in attention even without looking, because attention like that does not need to be seen to be understood. Her movements remained steady, but internally, her awareness sharpened, because she knew exactly what came next. Not confrontation, investigation. And investigation was far more dangerous. She adjusted her path slightly, moving toward a quieter side of the restaurant, away from central attention, not in retreat, but in control, because controlling distance means controlling exposure. But Grayson did not lose track of her. He followed, not physically at first, with observation, because rushing toward answers often destroys them, and he needed clarity, not assumption. He signaled subtly to one of his associates seated nearby, someone trained not to ask questions, only to execute. A quiet instruction, a direction, nothing obvious, but enough, because answers were now required. Ava reached the service corridor, a space removed from the elegance of the main floor. The lighting was softer, the sounds quieter, the environment less controlled by appearance. It was here that reality existed. She paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the counter as she allowed herself a moment to think, because the past had just stepped into present, and it had done so too soon. Her reflection in the stainless surface stared back at her, not as a waitress, not as a role, but as something else entirely, something she had spent years trying to bury, because this life, this simple, controlled, invisible life, had not been chosen randomly. It had been necessary. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes people don't run from poverty. They run from power. Ava had not always been Ava Monroe, at least not in the way the world knew her now. Her past had not been built on survival. It had been built on proximity, to power, to influence, to people like the Vale family. Years ago, her life had existed in a completely different world. One defined by polished rooms, controlled conversations, and decisions made behind closed doors. A world where names mattered, where connections defined identity, where trust was never freely given. She had grown up within reach of that world, not inside it completely, but close enough to understand it, close enough to see its structure, close enough to realize its danger. Her family had not been weak. They had been involved, strategically placed within circles that intersected with power, business, influence, and quiet alliances that shaped outcomes long before they became visible. And through that connection, she had seen the Vale family, not as distant figures, as reality. Eleanor Vale had not been a stranger to her. She had been presence, authority, control, A woman who understood power not as something to display, but something to maintain. Ava had learned from that world, observed it, understood it, but she had also seen something else. The cost, because power always comes with consequence, and those consequences had not spared her. The shift in her life had not been gradual. It had been immediate, sharp, irreversible. One event, one decision, one moment that forced everything to change. Her family's position had collapsed, not publicly, not loudly, but completely. Connections severed, support withdrawn, names erased from circles that once welcomed them. And in that world, losing position does not mean stepping down. It means disappearing. Ava had understood it quickly, faster than most, because she had always seen more than she allowed others to know. Staying was not an option, because staying would have made her a target. So she left, not dramatically, not publicly, quietly, completely. She stepped away from everything tied to her past, her name, her connections, her identity, and she built something new, something invisible, something safe, a life where no one would look twice at her, a life where being overlooked was protection. That was how Ava Monroe was created, not as deception, as survival, back in the present. Her eyes closed briefly, her breathing steady, her thoughts aligned, because now that protection was breaking. Grayson Vale did not belong to her past by accident. He was part of it, directly, and if he started looking, he would find something. Maybe not everything, but enough to create risk. She exhaled slowly, pushing the thoughts aside, returning to control, because losing control was not an option. Not now, not again. Outside the corridor, Grayson had already begun his process. Information moved quickly in his world. Records, histories, background checks, things that most people believed were hidden, were not, and within minutes, fragments began to surface. Not complete, but enough to confirm one thing. Ava Monroe did not exist in the way she should. No clear history, no consistent background, no defined origin, which meant she had been constructed, deliberately. Grayson's expression hardened slightly as the realization settled, because people who build new identities are not ordinary. They are either hiding from something or protecting something, and both are dangerous. He moved now, not rushed, not aggressive, but intentional, toward the corridor where she had disappeared, because distance was no longer acceptable. Ava heard the shift before she saw him, the change in footsteps, the presence, controlled, confident, approaching. She did not turn immediately, because turning too quickly reveals awareness, and awareness reveals vulnerability. Instead, she resumed movement, stepping away from the counter, aligning herself back into her role. But the moment he entered, the space changed. Grayson stopped a few steps away, his gaze fixed on her, no longer distant, no longer dismissive, focused, direct. You're not who you say you are. The statement was not loud, but it carried weight. Ava did not react immediately. Her posture remained composed, her expression unchanged, because denial was not the strategy. Control was. She turned slowly, facing him fully now, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, not defensive, not submissive, balanced. And that confirmed everything for him, because people who are hiding do not stand like that. They break, they hesitate, they deflect. She did none of those things, which meant she was not just hiding. She was prepared. That realization sharpened his focus even further. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer casual. Ava held his gaze for a moment, not long, just enough, and then she looked away, not in avoidance, in decision, because answering that question would change everything, and she was not ready for that. Not here, not like this. So she stepped past him, calmly, without urgency, without explanation, returning to floor as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Grayson did not stop her, because stopping her physically would break the structure he still needed. But his mind did not stop, because now he had enough. Enough to know she was connected. Enough to know she was hiding. Enough to know this was bigger than it appeared. And as that understanding settled fully into place, aligning every fragment into one undeniable truth, one final realization formed with cold precision. Ava wasn't hiding from poverty. She was hiding from the Vale family itself. His mother's silence said more than any confession could. The truth had surfaced, but not fully. It lingered, unspoken, unresolved. Grayson Vale stood at the edge of something he could not yet define, but could no longer ignore. The fragments he had uncovered about Ava Monroe had not satisfied his need for clarity. They had only deepened it, because now this was no longer about curiosity. It was about connection, a connection that tied directly to one person he trusted to understand anything hidden within his world, Eleanor Vale, his mother. And yet, she had said nothing. That was the intellectual hook. Because when someone who always has answers chooses silence, it means the truth is too dangerous to speak. The restaurant had resumed its surface-level elegance, but beneath that fragile illusion, tension remained embedded in every movement. Conversations were quieter, observations sharper, awareness heightened. Grayson moved through it all with precision, his focus no longer divided. It was singular, directed toward Eleanor. She stood near the far end of the room, composed as always, her posture refined, her expression controlled. To anyone else, she appeared unchanged, unaffected by the disruption that had briefly unsettled the environment. But Grayson knew better, because he had seen it. That moment, when Ava had spoken her name, Eleanor Vale had reacted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for someone like him to recognize. And now, he needed to understand why. He approached her slowly, not with urgency, but with intent. His presence did not demand attention, but it shifted the space around him nonetheless. Because when purpose replaces curiosity, every step carries weight. Eleanor did not turn as he neared. She already knew, because awareness was something she had mastered long before him. You saw it too. Grayson's voice was low, controlled, direct. Not a question, a statement. Eleanor's gaze remained forward for a moment longer before she finally turned toward him. Her expression did not break. Her composure did not shift. But her silence confirmed everything. That was the emotional hook. Because silence is not the absence of truth. It is a refusal to release it. Grayson studied her carefully, his attention sharper now, more precise. He was no longer looking for surface reactions. He was analyzing restraint. Because restraint reveals more than reaction ever could. You know her. Again, not a question. A controlled push. Eleanor's eyes held it for a moment. Just a moment. But within that moment, something moved. Recognition. Not new. Old. Deep. Buried. And that alone was enough. Because it meant one thing. This was not coincidence. This was history. Eleanor turned slightly, her gaze shifting away from him, back toward the room. But she was no longer observing the guests. She was watching Ava, and the way she watched her was not distant. It was personal, weighted, filled with something far more complex than simple recognition. Regret. That realization settled into Grayson's mind with sharp clarity. Because regret does not come from strangers. It comes from decisions. From moments that cannot be undone, from actions that carry consequences long after they are made. And if Eleanor Vale, a woman who did not allow emotion to interfere with anything, was carrying regret connected to Ava Monroe, then this situation was far deeper than he had imagined. What did you do? Grayson asked quietly, not accusatory, but direct, because now this was no longer about who Ava was. It was about what had happened to her. Eleanor's posture remained composed, but something beneath it tightened. Subtle, controlled, but present. I didn't do anything, she replied. The words were calm, measured, but not convincing, because truth, when spoken, does not sound like that. That was the intellectual hook. Because denial is not always about lying. Sometimes it is about protecting a version of reality that cannot survive the truth. Grayson did not respond immediately because he understood something critical in that moment. Pushing harder would not get answers. Not from her. Not yet, because whatever existed between Eleanor and Ava was not something that could be exposed easily. It had been buried for a reason, and reasons like that are never simple. Across the room, Ava continued her work with the same quiet discipline, but her awareness had not left the conversation unfolding behind her. She could feel it, the shift, the attention, because she knew this was coming, not the confrontation, the recognition, and recognition was far more dangerous. Her hands remained steady, her movements precise, but internally, her control was tightening, because the past was no longer contained. It had entered the present fully now, and Eleanor was the key to all of it. Ava had not expected this. Not here, not like this. Because of all the possibilities she had calculated, this was the one she had tried hardest to avoid. Facing Eleanor Vale again, because Eleanor was not just part of her past. She was central to it. Back with Grayson, the silence between him and his mother stretched, but it was not empty. It was filled with meaning, unspoken, unresolved, and increasingly impossible to ignore. "You're hiding something," he said finally. Simple, direct, unavoidable. Eleanor did not deny it this time, but she did not confirm it either. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering for just a fraction of a second before lifting again. A small break, but enough. Enough to confirm what he already knew. "Yes," she said quietly. The word carried weight, because it was not just admission. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement changes everything. Grayson's focus sharpened immediately, because now they were no longer pretending. "Then tell me." But Eleanor shook her head slightly. Not refusal. Restraint. "Not here." That answer was more revealing than any explanation, because it meant the truth was not just complicated. It was dangerous. Dangerous enough that even speaking it in this environment was a risk. Grayson's jaw tightened slightly, because that was not acceptable. Not anymore. Not when he was already involved. Not when the situation had already crossed into something larger. But before he could press further, movement shifted the moment. Ava, she had approached. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but intentionally. Her presence entered the space between them with quiet control, her posture steady, her expression composed. But her eyes met Eleanor's, and everything stopped, because that look was not between strangers. It was not even between distant acquaintances. It was between people who shared something unresolved, something heavy, something that had never truly ended. Eleanor's composure held, but barely, because in that moment, the past was no longer memory. It was present, alive. Ava did not speak immediately, because words would break the structure holding everything together, and she was not ready for that. Not here, not in front of him. But her presence alone was enough. Grayson watched the exchange carefully, his awareness at its highest point, because now this was no longer hidden. This was visible, not in details, but in tension, in silence, in everything that was not being said. "You remember?" Ava said finally. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried something beneath it, something deeper, something that could not be ignored. Eleanor did not answer, but she did not need to, because her expression had already confirmed it. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes the past does not need to be explained. It only needs to be acknowledged to change everything. Grayson's attention moved between them, his understanding expanding rapidly, but still incomplete, because now he knew this was real. He knew this was significant, but he did not yet know why, and that was the most dangerous part. "Enough," he said, his tone sharper now, because control was slipping, and he would not allow that. "Someone needs to explain what this is." But Ava stepped back slightly, not in retreat, in decision, because explanation was not something she could give freely, not without consequence. And Eleanor remained silent, not because she did not have answers, but because she understood the cost of revealing them. The room around them continued to exist, but this moment had separated from it completely, because now this was no longer about appearances. This was about truth, and truth was waiting. Ava's gaze lingered on Eleanor for a moment longer before she turned away, not out of avoidance, out of control, because staying would force something she was not ready to face. Not yet, not here. Grayson watched her leave, his mind moving faster now, connecting fragments, building patterns, forming conclusions that still lacked one critical piece. The reason, the why behind everything. Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, but heavier. She didn't leave because she wanted to. The statement landed sharply, because it shifted the narrative completely. Grayson's gaze snapped back to her. What does that mean? But Eleanor shook her head again, not in refusal, in finality. It means, she said slowly, that some things were decided without her, and that changed everything. Because now, this was not just a hidden past. It was a forced one. Ava had not walked away. She had been pushed. And if Eleanor knew that, then she had been part of it. Grayson's final realization settled with cold precision, because now, this was no longer about curiosity. It was about truth, and truth was about to surface. Because Eleanor Vale knew exactly who Ava was, and why she had disappeared. She wasn't poor because life failed her. She was poor because someone powerful ruined her. The silence left behind by Eleanor's words did not fade. It settled, deep, unavoidable. Grayson Vale stood still, but internally, everything had shifted. The fragments he had gathered until now were no longer scattered. They were beginning to connect. Ava had not disappeared by choice. She had been forced out, and his family was involved. That realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as resistance. Because for someone like Grayson, raised in a world where his family represented structure, power, and control, the idea that they could have destroyed someone's life did not align. But truth does not depend on alignment. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most difficult truths are not the ones we don't understand. They are the ones that force us to question everything we believed was right. His gaze shifted across the room, finding Ava again, not as a waitress, not as a stranger, but as someone standing at the center of reality he had never considered. And for the first time, he did not see her as beneath him. He saw her as unknown. And unknown is what unsettles power the most. Ava continued moving through the restaurant, her composure intact, her role unchanged. But now, the weight of the past had caught up with her completely. There was no distance left, no separation. Everything she had built to stay hidden was beginning to break. But she did not stop, because stopping would mean facing it all at once. And she knew that moment was coming. Back with Eleanor, the air between her and Grayson remained tense, but now it carried something else. Truth, not spoken fully, but present. You knew, Grayson said, his voice lower now, sharper. Not a question, a realization. Eleanor did not deny it, because denial was no longer possible. Yes, the word was quiet, but it carried weight, because it confirmed what he had been resisting, that his family was not separate from this. It was part of it. Grayson's jaw tightened slightly, his thoughts moving faster now, searching for structure within something that felt increasingly unstable. What happened to her? He asked, not casually, not out of curiosity, but because now he needed to know. Eleanor hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. Because Eleanor Vale did not hesitate, not in business, not in decisions, not in truth, unless the truth carried consequences. She lost everything, Eleanor said finally, simple words, but heavy, because loss, on that scale, is never accidental. Grayson's focus sharpened further. How? Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly toward Ava before returning to him, and in that moment, something changed, not in her composure, but in her acceptance, because she understood this could not stay buried anymore. Because of a deal, she said quietly. That word, deal, landed sharply, because in their world, deals were not small. They shaped outcomes. They determined futures. They created winners and destroyed others. What deal? Grayson pressed. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had carried for far too long. An agreement between families, she said, and hers was the one that paid the price. The meaning settled instantly. Cold, clear, unavoidable. Ava's family had not collapsed randomly. They had been sacrificed, strategically, deliberately, and the Vale family had benefited. That was the emotional hook, because sometimes success is not built on strength. It is built on someone else's destruction. Grayson stepped back slightly, not physically, but mentally, because the foundation he had always stood on was no longer stable. You're saying he stopped, because finishing that sentence meant accepting it, and accepting it meant everything changed. Eleanor did not complete it for him. She didn't need to, because the truth was already there. Ava had felt the shift long before the words reached her, because the energy in the room had changed again, and this time it was heavier, more direct, because now the past was no longer hidden. It was being understood. Her steps slowed slightly, just for a moment, before she corrected herself, continuing forward with the same measured control. But internally, he knew, not everything, but enough, and that was dangerous, because understanding creates guilt, and guilt creates action, something she had spent years avoiding, because action would pull her back into a world she had fought to leave behind. Back in the present, Grayson's gaze returned to her, but now it carried something different. Not arrogance, not dismissal, conflict, because what he was seeing now did not match what he had believed before. She was not someone who had failed. She was someone who had been pushed out, forced down, silenced, and he had treated her like she deserved it. That realization hit harder than anything else, because arrogance is easy to maintain when you believe you are right. But the moment doubt enters, it cracks, and his arrogance was cracking. That was the emotional hook, because the hardest thing for a powerful person is not losing control. It is realizing they were wrong. Grayson moved again, this time toward her, not with authority, but with intent, because now he needed answers directly, not filtered, not hidden. Ava saw him approaching. Of course she did. And this time, she did not avoid him, because avoidance was no longer possible. They stopped a few steps apart, the space between them charged with everything that had just surfaced. Grayson looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, fully. You knew, he said, not accusing, not questioning, stating. Ava held his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying something deeper now, something heavier. Yes, the answer came without hesitation, because denial was no longer necessary. Grayson's next question came slower, more careful. Why didn't you say anything? Ava's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer immediately, because that question was not simple. It carried layers, history, pain, consequence, and answering it would open everything. But she did answer, quietly, because nothing would have changed. That line cut deeper than anything else, because it wasn't emotional. It was factual, and facts are harder to argue with. Grayson's expression tightened slightly, because he understood what she meant. In their world, power protects itself. Truth alone does not break systems, and she had known that for years. That was the intellectual hook, because sometimes silence is not weakness. It is a result of understanding how the system works. Ava's gaze shifted briefly away, then returned. You made your judgment, she continued, her voice steady, without knowing anything. No accusation, no anger, just truth. And that was heavier than anything else, because it forced him to face it, directly, completely. Grayson did not respond immediately, because there was nothing he could say that would undo that, nothing that would justify it, because she was right. He had judged her based on appearance, on status, on assumption, and those assumptions had been wrong. Completely, the silence between them stretched again, but this time it was different, not filled with tension, filled with realization. Ava stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in control, because she had said enough, more than enough, and staying longer would only complicate what was already unstable. But before she could turn away, Grayson spoke again. "Your family." He stopped briefly, choosing his words carefully now. "What happened to them was because of us?" Ava's expression didn't change, but her eyes did, because that question was the center of everything, and the answer could not be softened. Yes. One word. Clear, final, and irreversible. Grayson felt it fully, because now there was no uncertainty left, no doubt, no space to deny. His family's power had come at a cost. Her cost, and that realization settled into something far heavier than guilt, responsibility, because now he knew, and knowing changes everything. Ava turned this time, not abruptly, not emotionally, but with control, because the conversation was over. For now, she had not come back into this world to explain herself. She had come to survive, quietly, but now that quiet was gone, and everything was about to change. Grayson remained where he stood, his gaze following her, his thoughts no longer stable, no longer aligned with the version of reality he had lived in until now, because now he understood something he had never considered before. Power is not always earned. Sometimes it is taken, and when it is taken, someone else pays the price. His final realization settled with sharp clarity, because now he could not unsee it, could not ignore it, could not return to what he had been before. The woman he insulted might be the one his family owed everything to. The truth didn't just change how he saw her. It changed how he saw his own blood. The moment Ava walked away, something inside Grayson Vale did not return to its place. It shifted, permanently. What had begun as doubt had now turned into something far more dangerous. Certainty that something in his life, something foundational, had been hidden from him, not by strangers, by his own family. And once that realization takes hold, it does not fade. It demands answers. That was the intellectual hook. Because the most destabilizing truth is not discovering someone else's lie. It is discovering that your own reality was built on one. Grayson did not return to the dining floor, not immediately, because the environment that had once felt controlled now felt artificial, constructed, and he needed distance from it. He moved toward the private wing of the building, where access was restricted, where noise did not reach, where thought could exist without interruption, because now this was no longer about her. It was about everything. His family, his name, his history, and whether any of it was real. Hours later, the restaurant had emptied, but Grayson had not left. Instead, he had redirected his focus completely. Investigation. Not casual, not surface level. Deep, systematic. Because if Ava Monroe's past had been erased, then something had been deliberately hidden. And hidden things leave traces. He accessed internal records first. Old files, archived documents tied to family partnerships, acquisitions, and agreements that had shaped the Vale Empire over decades. Most of it was exactly what he expected. Structured, clean, controlled. But then he noticed the gaps. Small at first, barely visible. Missing entries in financial logs. Unexplained shifts in ownership transfers. Documents that should have existed, but didn't. And that was where the pattern began. Because absence is not random. It is created. Grayson leaned back slightly, his focus narrowing as the realization sharpened. Someone had removed pieces of history. Not carelessly. Precisely. That was the intellectual hook. Because erased history is more revealing than recorded history. It shows not just what happened, but what someone wanted to hide. He went deeper. Older records. Physical archives. Things that had not been fully digitized. Because older systems are harder to clean completely. And that was where he found it, a photograph, faded slightly with time, but preserved well enough to recognize faces. His mother, younger, standing beside a man he recognized from past business records. And between them, a young girl, not more than 10, her posture calm, her expression composed, her presence familiar. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked closer, because even through time, he recognized her. Ava, not as she was now, but unmistakably. Her. The realization hit instantly, because this was not a distant connection. This was proximity, close, personal, and deliberate, which meant she had not just known his family. She had been part of their world. That was an emotional hook, because the person he had treated like nothing had once stood beside his family as something significant. Grayson's grip on the photo tightened slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of what it represented, because this was no longer speculation. This was proof, and proof demands explanation. He moved quickly now, pulling additional files, searching for any mention of the name tied to her original identity. And then he found it, not in a full record, in a fragment, a legal reference tied to a dissolved partnership, a name partially erased, but still visible enough to reconstruct. Monroe Holdings, the same name she now used, but not as a company, as a memory. His mind connected it instantly. Ava Monroe was not hiding behind a random identity. She had kept part of it, a piece of what she had lost. And that meant her past had not been small. It had been powerful. He dug deeper, cross-referencing timelines, financial collapses, silent acquisitions. And there, buried beneath layers of controlled documentation, was the truth. Monroe Holdings had once been a strategic partner to the Vail family. Not minor, not replaceable, essential. A company that had controlled key access points within a larger network of influence. And then it disappeared. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, its assets absorbed, its name removed, its existence reduced to fragments. And the Vail Empire had expanded immediately after. The pattern was clear, too clear. This was not coincidence. This was strategy. And Ava's family had been the cost. Grayson exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling deeper now, because this was no longer about guilt. It was about truth, and truth was beginning to reshape everything. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Eleanor. She stepped inside without announcement, her presence composed, but her gaze already aware of what he had found, because she had expected this. Eventually, Grayson did not turn immediately. He held the photograph for a moment longer before placing it on the table between them. "You knew," he said, not a question, a fact. Eleanor's eyes moved to the image, and for the first time, her composure shifted, not visibly, but internally, because this was the part of the past she had hoped would remain buried. "That was before everything changed," she said quietly. But Grayson shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "That was before something was taken." The distinction was sharp and accurate. Eleanor did not deny it, because she couldn't. Not anymore. Grayson turned now, facing her fully, his expression no longer controlled in the same way. Not angry, but fractured, because this was not just information. This was betrayal. "You let it happen," he said. Again, not loud, but direct. Eleanor's silence answered before her words did, because silence, in moments like this, is admission. "That deal," Grayson continued, "it wasn't just business." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, and that small action confirmed everything. "It was necessary," she said finally. That word, necessary, landed heavily, because it justified something that should not have been justified. And that was the emotional hook, because the most dangerous decisions are not made out of cruelty. They are made out of what people believe is necessary. Grayson stepped back slightly, his mind rejecting the logic even as it understood it. Necessary for who? Eleanor did not answer immediately, because there was no answer that would make it right. For survival, she said eventually. For this family. Grayson's expression hardened, because now he understood the Vale Empire had not just grown. It had replaced something. Someone. Ava's family had not simply fallen. They had been removed. And Eleanor had allowed it, maybe even ensured it. The realization settled completely. Cold, clear, unavoidable. You protected it, he said. Not her. Eleanor's gaze dropped slightly, because that was true, and truth does not always come with defense. Grayson turned away again, his thoughts moving rapidly now, reconstructing everything he believed about his family, because now it was all different. Every success, every expansion, every story he had been told had a shadow, and that shadow had a name. Ava. That was the intellectual hook. Because loyalty to family becomes dangerous when the family itself is built on injustice. The silence in the room stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with consequence. Grayson's final thought aligned with sharp clarity, because now he understood the scale of this. If this truth surfaced fully, not just fragments, not just suspicion, but everything, then the Vale Empire would not just be questioned, it would be exposed. And exposure destroys power. He looked back at Eleanor one last time, his voice lower now, but more certain than ever. She knows everything, doesn't she? Eleanor did not answer, but she didn't need to, because the answer was already clear, and as that realization settled fully into place, carrying consequences far beyond what either of them could control, one final truth emerged with undeniable weight. If Ava told the full truth, the Vale Empire could collapse. He once saw her as nothing. Now she was the only person who could destroy him. The truth had settled, not as a passing realization, but as a permanent shift. Grayson Vale stood in a world that no longer aligned with the version he had known his entire life. The power he carried, the name he represented, the structure he had trusted, all felt different now, not because it had changed, because he finally understood it. And at the center of that understanding was Ava Monroe. That was the intellectual hook, because perception does not just change how you see others. It changes how you see yourself. He did not return to his previous routine, not fully, because routine depends on certainty, and certainty was gone. Instead, his attention remained fixed on her, not as obsession, as necessity. Because Ava was no longer just part of the situation. She was the key to everything he had uncovered. And more importantly, everything that had been hidden from him. Across the restaurant, Ava continued her work. But nothing about her presence was unnoticed anymore. Not by him. Her movements were still controlled. Her expression still composed. Her posture still grounded. But now, he understood what that control represented. Strength, not weakness. Discipline, not submission. Survival, not failure. That was the emotional hook. Because the strongest people are often the ones who had no choice but to become strong. Grayson watched her from a distance, not intruding, not disrupting. Because now, he understood something critical. Approaching her the way he had before was no longer possible. Because before, he had seen her as less. Now, he knew she was more. And that difference required a different approach. Ava felt it. Of course she did, because awareness had always been her advantage. The shift in his presence, the change in his attention, the absence of arrogance. All of it was visible, but she did not respond to it, because response creates connection, and connection was dangerous, not because of him alone, because of everything he represented. The Vale name, the system that had destroyed her past, the power that still surrounded him, and power never moves without consequence. She continued forward, maintaining distance, not physically, but strategically, because distance was control, and control was survival. Grayson finally moved, not directly toward her, but closer, reducing space, not forcing interaction, allowing it, because he understood something now. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be built, and building it requires patience. He stopped a few feet away, not speaking immediately, because silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was necessary. Ava acknowledged his presence with a brief glance, nothing more, not inviting, not rejecting, neutral, and that neutrality was deliberate. You were right. His voice was calm, not defensive, not commanding, just honest. Ava did not respond, because words were easy. Meaning was not. Grayson continued, his tone steady. I judge you without knowing anything. The admission was simple, but significant, because men like him did not admit fault easily. Ava turned slightly toward him now, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but her silence remained, because acknowledgement does not equal forgiveness. That was the intellectual hook, because recognizing a mistake does not undo its impact. Grayson understood that completely, which was why he did not push further. I know what happened, he added. That changed the moment, slightly, subtly, but enough, because now this was not about perception. It was about truth. Ava's eyes held us for a moment longer, searching, measuring, because statements like that carry weight, and weight must be verified. How much? She asked finally. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but direct. Grayson did not hesitate. Enough to know my family was responsible. The honesty was immediate, unfiltered, and that was new. Ava studied him carefully, because honesty from someone like him was rare. But rare does not mean trustworthy, not immediately. That was an emotional hook, because trust is not built on words. It is built on consistency over time. You should go back to your world, she said calmly. Not harsh, not emotional, but clear. Grayson didn't move. Because this one doesn't belong to me? He asked. Ava's expression didn't change. No, she replied, because this one already took everything from me. The statement landed heavily, because it was not accusation. It was fact, and facts do not need emphasis. Grayson felt it fully, because now there was no distance left between understanding and responsibility. He stood inside it, and that was something he could not ignore anymore. I can help you, he said. The words were careful, measured, but sincere. Ava's reaction was immediate, not visible, but internal, because that offer carried weight, not opportunity. Riss, you already did enough, she said, still calm, still controlled, but final. Grayson didn't step back, because retreat was not his intention. I didn't do that, he replied, not directly. Ava's gaze sharpened slightly. Power doesn't need to act directly, she said. It only needs to exist. That line cut deeper than anything else, because it was true, and truth is difficult to argue with. That was the intellectual hook, because responsibility does not disappear just because you didn't personally make the decision. Grayson absorbed it, did not reject it, because rejecting it would mean returning to ignorance, and that was no longer possible. Ava shifted slightly, creating distance again, because staying risked something she had spent years avoiding. Connection, not emotional. Strategic, because aligning with him meant stepping back into a system she had escaped, and she would not do that lightly. Not again. You don't understand what you're offering, she said quietly. Grayson's gaze remained steady. Then make me understand. Ava held his gaze, longer this time, because now this was not surface-level interaction. This was decision. If you help me, she said slowly, you're not fixing a mistake. She paused. Just enough. You're breaking your own system. The weight of that statement settled instantly, because it was not exaggeration. It was reality. Helping her was not simple. It was not contained. It would affect everything. His family, his name, his position, everything built on the foundation he had just begun to question. And that was an emotional hook, because doing what is right becomes difficult when it requires losing everything you've been given. Grayson did not look away, did not hesitate, because now his decision was forming, not fully, But clearly, I know, he said. And for the first time, there was no doubt in his voice. Ava saw it, recognized it, but she did not accept it. Not yet, because belief is not given. It is earned over time, through action, not intention. She stepped back again, this time preparing to leave the moment completely, because this conversation had reached its limit, for now. But before she could walk away, Grayson spoke one last time. I'm not walking away from this. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain. Ava paused, just for a second, because certainty is rare, especially from someone who had everything to lose. But she didn't turn back, because turning back would mean acknowledging something she was not ready to accept. Not yet. She continued forward, her step steady, her posture unchanged. But internally, something had shifted. Not trust, not belief, but awareness. Because now, he was no longer just part of the system she had escaped. He was becoming something else. A variable, and variables change outcomes. Grayson remained where he stood, watching her leave, but not with distance anymore, with understanding, because now he knew exactly what this meant. Not just for her. For him, helping Ava was not just about correcting a wrong. It was about choosing a side, and choosing a side creates consequences. His final realization settled with absolute clarity, because now there was no uncertainty left, no middle ground, no safe position. Helping Ava meant standing against his own family. For the first time, he chose truth over pride. The line had been drawn, not visibly, not formally, but undeniably. Grayson Vale stood at the edge of decision that could not be undone, a moment where everything he had been raised to protect stood in direct conflict with everything he had just learned to be true. And truth, once fully seen, does not allow retreat. That was the intellectual hook. Because real transformation does not happen when a person changes their opinion. It happens when they change what they're willing to lose. The restaurant, once a place of performance and illusion, had become something else entirely. Not a battlefield, not yet, but a space where outcomes were forming, where decisions made in silence would soon echo far beyond its walls. Ava Monroe stood within it, no longer invisible, no longer hidden, because hiding was no longer possible. Not after everything that had surfaced, not after everything that had been understood, but she did not step forward. Not yet, because exposure is not taken lightly. It is chosen, and choosing it means accepting everything that follows. Across the room, Eleanor Vale remained still, her composure intact, but her control was no longer absolute, because the past she had buried was no longer contained. It had returned, in the form of the one person she had hoped would never stand in front of her again. Ava. Grayson moved toward them both now, his step steady, his expression no longer divided, because his decision had already been made, not fully spoken, but formed, and once formed, it does not break. He stopped between them, not as a mediator, not as a son, but as someone standing inside truth for the first time. Fully, completely. This ends now, he said. His voice was calm, controlled, but final. Eleanor's gaze sharpened slightly, not defensive, but aware, because she understood this was not a moment she could manage. This was a moment she had to face. Ava did not react immediately, but her attention shifted fully toward him, because this was unexpected. Not his presence, his tone, because it carried something new, not authority, not assumption. Choice. That was the emotional hook. Because when someone raised inside power chooses truth over it, everything changes. Grayson turned slightly toward Eleanor. No more silence, he said. No more protection. The words were direct, unavoidable, because protection, in this context, was no longer defense. It was concealment. Eleanor held his gaze, her posture steady, but something beneath it had already shifted, because she knew this moment had been coming for years, and now it had arrived. You don't understand what you're asking, she said quietly. But Grayson did not hesitate. I understand exactly what I'm asking. His voice did not rise. It didn't need to, because certainty is louder than force. Eleanor's silence followed, not immediate, not reactive, but heavy, because the truth she had carried was not simple. It was layered, built on decisions that had been justified at the time, but could not survive exposure now. And Ava stood at the center of it, the one person who had lived the consequence, the one person who had paid the price. Grayson turned toward her next, his gaze steady, his presence grounded. "You don't have to stay silent anymore," he said, not commanding, not persuasive, offering. Ava held his gaze, searching, not for sincerity, for consistency, because words could still be reversed. Actions could not. "You think this changes anything?" she asked quietly. Her tone was not defensive. It was factual, because from her perspective, this was not resolution. It was risk. Grayson did not look away. "Yes," he said, "it changes everything." That was the intellectual hook. Because truth does not fix the past, but it reshapes the future. Ava studied him for a moment longer, because now this was no longer about him alone. It was about what would happen next, because stepping forward meant stepping back into the world she had escaped, the world that had taken everything from her, and she would not return to it, unless it was on her terms, fully, completely, without control, without silence. Her posture shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough, because internally, a decision was forming, not out of emotion, out of clarity, because she understood something now. The truth was already out, partially, and partial truth is more dangerous than full truth, because it leaves space for manipulation, for distortion, for control to reassert itself. And she would not allow that. Not again. That was the emotional hook. Because sometimes speaking the truth is not about justice. It is about refusing to be erased. Ava stepped forward, not toward Grayson, toward Eleanor, because this had always been between them. The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer avoidance. It was acknowledgement. "You remember everything," Ava said, her voice steady, controlled, but undeniable. Eleanor did not respond immediately, because responding meant confirming, and confirming meant ending the silence permanently. But she did respond. Yes, one word, simple, but absolute. And with that, the past was no longer hidden. Grayson's attention sharpened further, because now this was no longer speculation. This was truth, direct, unfiltered. "What happened to her family?" he asked. Not to Ava, to Eleanor, because now there was no reason to hide it. Eleanor's composure held, but her voice carried weight when she spoke again. "They were removed," she said, "not softened, not disguised, because truth does not need to be for the deal to succeed." The words landed heavily, because they confirmed everything, not just involvement, responsibility. Ava did not react outwardly, but internally, the weight shifted, because hearing it, spoken, changed something, not her past, her position within it. She was no longer the one carrying a hidden truth. She was the one holding a revealed one. And that was a power shift, because knowledge, when exposed, transfers control. Grayson absorbed it fully, because now there was nothing left to question, nothing left to deny, only something left to decide. And he had already made that decision. "I'm not protecting this anymore," he said, his voice firm, certain, final. Eleanor's gaze met his, searching for hesitation. There was none, because he had crossed that line already, internally, irreversibly. "And what do you think happens next?" she asked quietly. Grayson did not hesitate. "The truth stands." That answer was everything, because it meant he understood the cost and accepted it. Ava watched him carefully, because this was the moment, the one that defined everything, not his words, his position. And his position was clear. He was standing with truth, not with power, not with family, with truth. That was the emotional hook, because choosing truth over loyalty is the hardest decision a person can make. Ava's final hesitation faded, Not because the risk disappeared, because the clarity outweighed it. She turned slightly, her posture grounded, her presence no longer that of someone hiding behind simplicity, because that version of her was gone, completely. "I'm not Ava Monroe," she said, her voice calm, but undeniable. The statement shifted the entire space, because names carry identity, and identity defines reality. Grayson's attention locked onto her fully. Eleanor's breath stilled, because now this was no longer controlled. This was exposure. "I never was," she continued. "I just needed a name that no one would question." The truth unfolded with precision, not emotional, not dramatic, but complete. And with each word, her position changed, from someone hidden to someone undeniable. Grayson did not interrupt, because this was hers, fully, completely. And Eleanor listened, not as a strategist, not as someone in control, but as someone facing the consequence of decisions she had made years ago. The silence that followed was not empty. It was final, because now everything had been exposed. The past, the truth, the structure that had held it together, broken, irreversibly. Grayson stood beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside, because now this was no longer about protection. It was about alignment. Ava did not look at him. She didn't need to, because she already knew he had chosen, and that choice had changed everything. The system that once controlled her no longer had that power, because she had taken something back, not her past, her voice, her truth, her position, and that was everything. Grayson's final realization settled with absolute clarity, because now he understood the full weight of what had just happened, not just for her, for him, for his family, for everything built on the foundation that had just been exposed, because the truth does not stay contained. It spreads, it reshapes, it destroys, and rebuilds. And as that realization locked into place, leaving no room for denial, no space for retreat, no path back to ignorance, one final truth remained. He thought she was just a poor waitress, but she was a secret his family had buried for years.